Three key things impacting black quality of life nationally was housing, employment, and education. Because all three were exacerbating the crime rate, which was then used to criticize funding for housing, employment, and education in a vicious cycle. Anti-black bias raged in the form of the best-selling book The Bell Curve, published by Charles Murray in 1994. The book argued that IQ was largely inherited and unchangeable, and used as an excuse to justify not wasting money on social programs. The justification was that a low IQ, which Murray attached to black Americans, correlated with poverty, crime, and out-of-wedlock children. It called for an elimination of aid for poor mothers, an end to affirmative action because it put low IQ people of color into situations above their ability levels, and a shift from family-based immigration to merit-based immigration. Critics pointed out the book's many flaws. Declared Nicholas Lehman for Slate in 1997, The Bell Curve, it turns out, is full of mistakes ranging from sloppy reasoning to miscitations of sources to outright mathematical errors. Unsurprisingly, all the mistakes are in the direction of supporting the author's thesis. Even still, the book continued to be cited as groundbreaking among conservatives and racists. Despite the critiques lobbed at black people and their intelligence, the real problem was American schools, via underfunding, racism, zero-tolerance policies, and resegregation, which is something we'll get into more in depth in the next episode about growing up in the 90s. But what about employment? For some, the military, which had been volunteer only since 1973, beckoned. As America propagandized its Gulf War victory and celebrated the highest-ranking member of the military, Colin Powell, a few noted that nearly 25% of the participants were black, a disproportionate amount due to black people being 12% of the population. They were also 15% of the war's casualties. Against the Current also reported, although only 11% of the military is women, 48% of the women stationed in the Gulf are black, and 60% of those are mothers. Critics were wary of the Gulf War and other conflicts, calling for American intervention because of the so-called poverty draft, and this would impact the black community's response to foreign affairs. This nation ought to be ashamed that the best and brightest of our youth don't volunteer because they love it so well, but because this nation can't provide them jobs, said Dr. Benjamin L. Hooks. Black Americans would go on to be 12% of the armed forces, providing them and their families with benefits that made their perspective on foreign policy much different than others. To put it simply, the military was a way to grind to the middle class, as scores of black and Latino teens would learn via frequent visits from lunchroom recruiters. As we explored in the last episode, the job market wasn't too hot, and it could be extra challenging when black. A September 1991 Diane Sawyer Primetime Live episode showed the stark differences in treatment between a black man and a white man's experiences in St. Louis. From being ignored by salesmen, to being followed, to being harassed, to being overcharged for cars, to housing discrimination, to job discrimination, the expose put it all on the table.
Salesman who followed Glenn around in that store. Men like that would say to you, this is not racist behavior. Black people commit more crime as a percentage of population. That's why I followed him.
If I could get you in the car for, say, 95 even, think you'd be interested?
Once again, a big difference. That salesman appeared, and we asked him why John and Glenn were quoted different figures.
Well, they're all different. It just depends.
Two guys come in looking at the same car. What's the difference? For him, the banks will do 10 to 20. For him, 20, 25? What's the difference?
Depends on the vehicle, ma'am.
They were looking at the same vehicle.
Oh, okay.
What's the difference?
In the year prior to the Diane Sawyer expose, there were 3,272 reports to the EEOC about racial discrimination in the workplace. And by 1999, there were over 6,249 reports a year, citing everything from slurs to finding nooses in doorways, with close to 50,000 total for the decade. In 2000, it was reported that there were dozens of noose-related incidents in the 90s. People were getting more comfortable reporting harassment and racism in the workplace, as well as racist customer service, after a slew of early 90s lawsuits. After After Shoney's had been sued for employee discrimination in 1989, a woman named Helen Jones filed a lawsuit in 1991 because she had been passed over for promotions and had been harassed with racist comments. There were 759 Shoney's restaurants in 35 states, and many of them had been similarly racist to their black employees. According to the Washington Post, CEO Raymond Danner was so adamant about holding down the number of black employees that managers hid blacks from view, including an instance where a black employee was told to hide in a restroom when Danner paid them visits. Employment applications were color-coded to separate blacks from whites, and blacks, if hired, were tracked into kitchen jobs so they would not be seen in the dining areas. Shoney's was ordered to pay $105 million to 40,000 current and former workers, as well as some job applicants. Shoney's was also ordered to be monitored for further discrimination for the next 10 years. The same year of the Jones lawsuit, 6 black college students sued IHOP in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because employees refused to seat them and locked them out of the building, highlighting an ongoing issue of unequal treatment in businesses. The suit would be settled in 1992 for $185,000. Denny's had 1,400 chains in the 1990s and profits of $1.53 billion per year when it was accused of making black customers prepay. In court, it was revealed that one former manager instructed employees to close the location when too many black customers approached. A 15-year-old black girl named Rachel Thompson of Vallejo, California, was refused a customary free birthday meal in 1992 and was added to a lawsuit featuring 6 United States Secret Service officers who were forced to sit and wait for an hour in Annapolis, Maryland, while their white co-workers were served. Yes, literal members of Bill Clinton's Secret Service detail. Denny's was owned by Flagstaff, a Spartanburg, South Carolina company, whose CEO was Jerome Jerry Richardson, who was preparing to erect the Carolina Panthers Stadium on the site of a Charlotte lynching. Richardson embarked on fixing Denny's image by publicizing that it would include more black people as customers and employees in ads. As late as May 1994, none of the 1,400 Denny's locations were ran by black franchisees, and due to the PR nightmare of the lawsuits, there were 27 black franchisees by 1996. Rather than admitting wrongdoing, Flagstar paid $54 million to 295,000 aggrieved customers and their lawyers, due to a federal government brokered mediation. Corporations were receiving a message that workplace environments that allowed racism would be expensive to maintain. And still, the lawsuits kept coming. After years of underpaying its black employees and being exposed for it, Texaco executives discussed destroying evidence, not knowing that they were being recorded by a fellow executive. When this news broke, Jesse Jackson called for a boycott of Texaco on November 12, 1996, and by November 15th, the company was agreeing to pay $115 million to $176 million in damages, plus giving pay raises of at least 10% to approximately 1,400 employees. The strength of the black community and its allies was shown to be truly formidable. After the boycott was announced, Texaco shares had dropped by over $5 apiece, and the company lost $1 billion in market value. As for Coca-Cola, the company was sued in 1999 because black employees earned an average of $26,000 less than whites.
And if these workers begin to give their testimony in court, they're going to win in the court of law and the court of public opinion. That's for Coke would do well and be wise to move quickly.
Coke settled for $192.5 million the next year and donated money to local Atlanta area programs to benefit the black community while it continued to pump dangerous levels of sugar into the population. And then there was the Cracker Barrel, who after various complaints by former employees, the NAACP finally agreed to sue in 1999. A lawsuit by customers would follow up in 2001, and by 2004, the U.S. Justice Department affirmed that the restaurant segregated customers by race. So if you know how we got them jokes about Cracker Barrel being racist? Yeah, like they was legit about that life. Cracker Barrel would eventually settle for $8.7 million and hire a bunch of minorities to compensate. The obvious discrimination in employment, education, and housing obviously kept crime a serious problem. And I don't want to downplay the crime of the 90s, which was lower than the 80s, but higher than now. Between 1990 and 2000, the homicide rate dropped by 44%. Also, violent crime rates per capita fell from 729.6 per 100,000 people to 506 per 100,000 people. This was progress, but still high when compared to current modern violent crime rates. In 1995, 1991, after 2 students were murdered in a drive-by at Dunbar High School in Baltimore, Maryland, a student asked visiting Vice President Al Gore, "What are you going to do? And when are you going to do it?" In Detroit in 1994, the 81-year-old civil rights icon Rosa Parks was attacked and robbed by a 29-year-old black man named Joseph Skipper, who had robbed other elderly black women. To make matters worse, police took between 40 to 50 minutes to reach her home after a neighbor called the police. Skipper was eventually hunted down and beaten before being shipped off to prison, prompting Parks to remark, "Many gains have been made, but as you can see, at this time, we still have a long way to go, and so many of our children are going astray." The owner of Little Caesars Pizza, Mike Ilitch, quietly paid to move her to a safer part of Detroit. If senseless violence could touch a black civil rights icon, it could touch anybody.
You gave me this job, and we're making progress on the things you hired me to do. But unless we deal with the ravages of crime and drug and violence, and unless we recognize that it's due to the breakdown of the family, the community, and the disappearance of jobs, and unless we say some of this cannot be done by government because we have to reach deep inside to the values, the spirit, the soul, and the truth of human nature, none of the other things we seek to do will ever take us where we need to go.
That speech that Clinton gave in 1993 was well received. It's funny that most of Clinton's paternalistic rhetoric was being said by Farrakhan and other black conservatives, as well as black Democrats. Of course, motherhood and marriage gets a deep dive in episode 5, as well as Clinton's numerous sexual scandals, but it's key to understand the general beliefs of most voting black Americans at this time made that speech well received. The next year, in 1994, in front of 12,000 members of the National Baptist Convention USA, who you remember sent the letter in support of Mike Tyson, Clinton said, "You shouldn't have a baby before you're ready, and you shouldn't have a baby when you're not married. You just have to stop it. I'll try to do my part, but this is not a government deal. This is the way people are behaving, as if there were no respect for themselves and no future. We have to stop." This speech, delivered in the wake of the crime bill, made Jesse Jackson remark, "One would expect him to come here and speak of economic stimulus and jobs and economic development. Instead, we are getting moral lessons on how to live, and they are good moral lessons, but we must fight welfare and crime with jobs and economic development." The crime bill that Clinton signed was stuffed with incentives for various groups. An assault weapons ban, funds for midnight basketball to give inner city teens a sense of community and late night activities, the Violence Against Women Act and guidelines to track sex offenders, all that pleased liberals. For law and order conservatives and those who claim to care purely about economics, there was the removal of Pell Grants for inmates, $9 million earmarked for prison construction, $8 billion to hire 100,000 cops, the 3 strikes provision, and new sentencing provisions that expanded the federal death penalty, mandatory minimum sentencing, and incentives for states to be harsher with sentencing and to limit parole. At the signing, Clinton was joined by black women, like when he would sign the welfare bill. It had the support of various black leaders, like the first black mayor of Baltimore, Kurt Shmoke, who you may recall also called for the decriminalization of weed back in the 80s. In his city, violent crime had grown during the period of 1987 to 1993, while nationwide averages had dropped. 39 clergy members signed a letter supporting the crime bill, and 10 black mayors of Atlanta, Cleveland, Detroit, Denver, and others sent a letter of support to the Congressional Black Caucus. Only 10 black members in the House of Representatives out of 38 voted against the crime bill in protest of the death penalty additions. And according to a 1994 poll, 58% of non-white voters supported the crime bill, compared to 49% of white voters. Of course, others saw the canary in the coal mine. Black leaders like John Conyers promoted alternative crime bills that didn't rely on prison expansion. Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition lobbied against the crime bill, and Time magazine even pointed out that more prisons wasn't a solid solution. While police had long been able to be corrupt without much interference, the 1994 crime bill would incentivize corruption like never before. At the same time, Clinton's critics, like Bob Dole in a 1996 interview with Ebony magazine, insisted that Clinton had transformed the war on drugs into a full retreat, chiding Clinton for proposing eliminating hundreds of drug enforcement positions and promising Ebony's readers that if he were elected, he'd bring the hammer of the law down on criminals and dealers. A continued concern in the over-policing of black citizens was the racial profiling of motorists that came to be known as driving while black. In 1996's Wren versus United States, the Supreme Court ruled that police officers can stop any motor vehicle if a traffic violation has been observed, which led to over-policing, harassment, and discrimination. A bunch of academic study would be devoted to the phenomena of driving while black, and most would come to the conclusion in various cities and states that black people were more likely to be pulled over than any other motorist. For instance, New Jersey was forced to pay $775,000 to 12 motorists after an analyst viewed the data of a turnpike in Gloucester County. He found African Americans made up 13.5% of the turnpike's population and 15% of the speeders, but they represented 35% of those pulled over. In stark numbers, blacks were 4.85 times as likely to be stopped as were others. In the sundown town of Belleville, Missouri, the police pulled over black citizens from nearby East St. Louis, Illinois so frequently that it warranted news coverage.
Why do you think you stopped him?
Because I was black. Definitely because I was black, and I had two black gentlemen in the car with me.
Did he say anything to you that would lead you to that conclusion?
Definitely, because he asked me what was I doing up in Belleville. Like I wasn't good enough to be up here at all.
If you were black and came to Belleville, there was a good chance you were going to be stopped, questioned, maybe ticketed for a minor violation, maybe arrested and taken to jail.
After a 4-month investigation that involved dozens of interviews with anonymous police sources and motorists, and after going through more than 175,000 traffic tickets, the News Democrat was able to document that Belleville Police Chief Bob Hurst had organized a special 4-man patrol to target and harass black motorists from East St. Louis.
The wealthy citizens of Belleville even funded a gate to keep out East St. Louis residents. That's right, Sundown Towns in the 90s.
I don't want Belleville to become another East St. Louis, and neither does the Belleville residents.
That fear is so widespread that a few years ago, when a crime wave swept the wealthy Signal Hill area of Belleville, residents got together and spent their own money to build a wrought iron gate right on the edge of the city.
To really hearken to the old days, there were 145 attacks on black churches from 1995 to 1996, leading to the establishment of the National Church Arson Task Force and the 1996 Church Arson Prevention Act. According to the National Church Arson Task Force, 33% of all arsons and bombing attacks at houses of worship from January 1995 to August 2000 were at black churches. In January 1996, 18 Molotov cocktails were thrown at Inner City Baptist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. Someone painted "Die Nigger Die" and "White is Right" on the church's back door. The church was the home of Green Bay Packers player Reggie White, which brought national attention to the recurring fire attacks. Bill Clinton, who was up for re-election, showed up for the church reopening. Said Reggie White a year after the attack, "This is just what I feared would happen. In an election year, the awareness was heightened, but now it's gone. You're not hearing about it anymore." And the arsonists were never found, despite massive evidence and years of investigations. 3 days after the Knoxville attack, 2 black churches in rural Alabama were burned to the ground on the same night. The next month, 3 churches within a 6-mile radius of Louisiana were set on fire, coinciding with the anniversary of the Greensboro, North Carolina Woolworth sit-in. 4 months later, a church was set on fire in Charlotte, North Carolina. The next year, when 2 men burned down Macedonia Baptist Church in Ferris, Texas, they tell prosecutors that it was because it was a nigger church. While some believed the attacks to be a coordinated conspiracy, reported the Washington Post later that year, the people burning down black churches in the South are generally white, male, and young, usually economically marginalized or poorly educated, frequently drunk or high on drugs, rarely affiliated with hate groups, but often deeply driven by racism. Is it just me, or are a bunch of unaffiliated racists not much better than, connected ones? These hateful fires were not aberrations, but an indictment of a right-wing system of punditry and propaganda, fusing with neoliberal negligence to strengthen the hateful bigots we discussed in Lectual Does the 80s American Psyche. On June 7th, 1998, James Byrd Jr., the 49-year-old cousin of Rodney King's first wife, accepted a ride from 3 white men in Jasper, Texas. In this modern-day lynching, lynching. Byrd was beaten, urinated and defecated on, and dragged by a truck until dead. The three white men, Sean Berry, Lawrence Brewer, and John King, then dropped Byrd's body off in front of a black cemetery and headed to a cookout. All three men, two of whom had white supremacist backgrounds, were charged with murder and hate crimes, and all three were found guilty in a trial that brought out the KKK to the courthouse. Two, Brewer and King, received the death penalty. Though Governor George Bush opposed the hate crime additions, they stuck. It was the first time in Texas history that white people were held responsible for the lynching of a black man. Basketball star Dennis Rodman paid for Byrd's funeral and gave the family $25,000, while boxing promoter Don King gave his children $100,000. This murder was one of many injustices suffered by black people in our history in this country, but its 1998 timestamp made it slightly different from past acts of lynching. On one hand, the crime caused Texas to pass a hate crime law, and the only black juror on the trial was made the foreman. On the other hand, John King, who was covered in racist tattoos that became a key piece of his trial, wrote to a friend that he had made history, signing his letter with the Sag Hell. An officer would recall that when he gave his statement, he said, "We're starting the Turner Diaries early," mentioning the white supremacist novel that, since being published in 1978, had galvanized other racists into action. King was characterized as having been obsessed with race after reading the Turner Diaries in prison and becoming a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, a prison gang that was rapidly becoming more powerful on the inside than the Italian mafia. As we'll find out in episode 6 of this series, the radical, conspiracy-loving, increasingly violent white right was feeling emboldened and creating militias and a generation of lone wolves whose economic frustrations and/or drug use and untreated mental illness were catalysts for hate, violence, and racism.